12 minutes. That's all I have before the FBI kicks in the door. My best friend just handed me a death sentence, SEC documents with my signature on every page. I'm not running yet. I'm moving. The crystal award in my hand is still warm from the guard's skull. David's keycard burns in my pocket, but the numbers on the screen don't lie. Julian didn't just frame me. He dug up my father's ghost to bury me with him. $40 million, all traced back to a man who's been dead for years. My name, my blood, my crime. The scent of expensive bourbon and ozone hung heavy in the air 50 floors above San Francisco. Marcus Vance adjusted his silk tie, the fabric slick against his damp palms. Crystal flutes clinked like wind chimes, a sharp contrast to the low roar of venture capitalists celebrating an IPO that shouldn't exist. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Salesforce Tower offered a panoramic view of the city. But tonight, the fog rolled in like a sentient shroud, turning every street corner below into a hiding place for something unseen. The orange glow of street lamps reflected off the wet pavement in distorted, oily smears miles beneath his feet. A hand clamped onto Marcus's shoulder. Julian Thorne leaned in, his breath smelling of peppermint and cold ambition. He didn't smile. He simply tilted his head toward the windows, where the city lights flickered like dying embers. The SEC found the trail, Julian murmured, his voice a dry rasp beneath the jazz quartet's rhythm. They have the digital signature, Marcus. Every string of data bears your thumbprint. It's quite the legacy we've built, isn't it? Or rather, the legacy you've left behind. Marcus stiffened. The mahogany bars seemed to tilt. He searched Julian's eyes for a bluff, but found only the flat gray of a tombstone. Julian never sat with his back to a door, and even now, in the middle of a celebration, he was positioned to see every entrance to the gala hall. It was a paranoid ritual Marcus had seen 1,000 times, but tonight, it felt predatory. Fraud is a heavy word for a gala, Julian added, patting Marcus's chest before disappearing into a cluster of tech moguls. But then again, we are architecting the future. Sometimes the foundation needs to be cleared of debris. Panic surged, a bitter copper taste coating Marcus's tongue. He needed to find David Chen, the chief technology officer. David was the only one who could have helped Julian manipulate the logs. Marcus scanned the ballroom, spotting David near the terrace. David stood laughing, a caviar blinny halfway to his mouth, oblivious, or perhaps perfectly aware, of the collapse of their empire. Marcus lunged through the crowd, shoving past a waiter carrying a silver tray. His lungs burned. The air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive lilies and spilled champagne, a floral musk so heavy it made his eyes water. 10 feet from his partner, a wall of dark wool blocked his path. Robert Wilson, Julian's lead security contractor, stepped into Marcus's line of sight. Robert was a mountain of a man with a military fade and a jagged scar across his left knuckles. He maintained a rigid 3-foot distance, his arms crossed over his chest like a suit of armor. "Mr. Vance," Robert said, his voice a flat barrier. "We should discuss your exit strategy in private. Follow me." Robert didn't wait for an answer. He hooked a thick finger into the crook of Marcus's elbow and steered him away from the lights, away from David, and toward the VIP coat room. The transition was jarring. One moment, Marcus was bathed in the golden light of the IPO celebration, and the next, he was being shoved into a claustrophobic tunnel of heavy fur coats and wool blazers. The rows of designer outerwear swallowed the light and muffled the sound, leaving only the rhythmic, low-frequency thumping of the bass from the party next door. It felt like a punch to the chest with every beat. "Julian says you're a flight risk," Robert stated, his hand moving to his tie. He straightened it once, twice, 3 times. The 3-tie tug Marcus knew signaled an imminent physical confrontation. Marcus didn't wait for the 3rd tug to finish. His eyes darted to a side table where a heavy crystal award, a jagged shard of glass meant to celebrate their innovation of the year, sat atop a velvet cloth. His fingers, usually precise enough to align pens to the millimeter, gripped the cold, sharp edges of the trophy. As Robert lunged, Marcus swung with the desperation of a man who had already lost his world. The crystal connected with the side of Robert's head with a sickening, wet thud. The big man grunted, his knees buckling as he collapsed into a rack of trench coats. The sound was swallowed by the heavy wool. Breathing hard, Marcus looked down at the unconscious guard. He felt a wave of nausea, but pushed it back. He needed access. He needed to get to the servers before the feds arrived. He remembered the feigned embrace he'd seen Julian give David earlier. He needed David's keycard. But Robert was the one carrying the high-level bypass for this floor. Marcus knelt, his hands shaking as he rifled through the guard's pockets. He found it. A heavy, black plastic card with a biometric thumbprint scanner. It felt cold, like a dead thing, in his palm. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled out his own phone, a device he'd stripped of all GPS and tracking software, and tapped it against the stolen keycard. He had a small mobile reader, an analog-to-digital bridge he'd built himself. The screen flickered to life, showing the card's permissions, subverted. Marcus felt a surge of professional pride as the bypass worked. He was still the smartest man in the room. He had the key. Now, he just needed to see the extent of the damage Julian had done. He tapped into the card's recent activity logs, expecting to see his own name forged on a few offshore transfers. After all, Julian needed a scapegoat for the missing $40 million. Marcus had spent his life building firewalls, believing that if he controlled every byte, he could never be blindsided. He felt a sense of relief. Once he saw the specific forgeries, he could write a counterscript to prove the timestamps were faked. He scrolled deeper into the encrypted metadata. The relief died instantly. The logs didn't just show Marcus's name. They showed a social security number that made the blood freeze in his veins. It was his father's. His father, who had been dead for 5 years. Julian hadn't just forged Marcus's signature. He had resurrected a dead man's identity to act as the primary beneficiary of the stolen $40 million. The trail was masterful. It looked as though Marcus had inherited a secret family slush fund, a conspiracy of embezzlement that spanned decades. It painted Marcus not as a victim of a corporate frame-up, but as the scion of a criminal dynasty who had used Nexalink to wash his father's dirty money. The world tilted. Marcus gripped the edge of a coat rack to keep from falling. The irony was a physical blow. He had spent his entire career trying to outrun the shadow of his father's failures, trying to be the clean tech genius, and Julian had used that very trauma to bury him. The smart move, stealing the card to find the fraud, had revealed a trap so deep there was no climbing out. He wasn't just facing prison. He was facing the total erasure of his identity. He had been so focused on the digital back door that he never noticed Julian walking through the front door of his life with a shovel. The muffled bass of the party felt like a funeral dirge. He looked at the heavy crystal award, now stained with a streak of red. He had to move. The logic didn't scale anymore. He wasn't just debugging a breach. He was fighting for the very soul of his history. He slipped out of the coat room, the scent of scorched dust and ozone hitting him as he bypassed the main hall and headed for the service stairs. He couldn't risk the elevators. They were glass boxes, perfect for a public arrest. As he reached the heavy steel door of the stairwell, he saw a flickering blue light through the lobby's glass partition 50 floors below. Agent Sarah Miller had arrived. Sarah Miller stood in the sterile, white marble lobby of the Salesforce Tower, her sensible navy blazer a sharp contrast to the evening gowns and tuxedos fluttering around her. She felt like an intruder, an emotion she had carried since she was 6 years old. She adjusted her glasses and whispered, "Sorry," to a velvet stanchion she brushed against. It was a reflex, a verbal tic that highlighted her belief that her very presence was an inconvenience. "Federal warrants," she said to the head of security, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She didn't look him in the eye. Instead, she focused on the exit sign above his head. "We have reason to believe Marcus Vance is attempting to destroy evidence on the 59th floor. Lock the elevators. Now." She didn't wait for a polite response. She bypassed the security protocols with a federal override key, the little plastic device chirping as it turned the lobby's smart gates into open doors. She was efficient, following the law to the letter, hoping that by being a perfect agent, she could justify the space she took up in the world. Upstairs, Marcus heard the heavy clack of the elevator banks locking down. He ducked into the service stairwell, the raw concrete walls casting everything in the sickly yellow of a bruise. His footsteps echoed 10 times over, creating a cacophony that made it impossible to tell if the sound was coming from above or below. He froze, paralyzed by the sound of his own breathing bouncing back at him. As he reached the landing of the 55th floor, his hand brushed the underside of the heavy metal door handle. He felt something cold and smooth. He pulled it away. A burner phone taped to the steel with surgical precision. The screen was black, but a small green light at the top was pulsing. It was transmitting. Paranoia, cold and sharp, spiked in his gut. Someone was tracking him in real time. Not the feds. They would have just kicked the door down. This was internal. Julian's reach extended into the very bones of the building. Marcus tore the phone from the door and threw it down the center of the stairwell. He watched it fall, a tiny spark of green disappearing into the darkness of the lower floors. He had to move faster. His ribs ached, a dull throb that reminded him of the struggle in the coat room. He climbed, his lungs burning in the thin, climate-controlled air. When he reached the 59th floor landing, he burst through the door, expecting the quiet hum of the server room. Instead, he found a shadow. Robert Wilson's partner, a second henchman with a shaved head and a high-voltage taser, was waiting. The man didn't speak. He stepped forward, the taser crackling with a blue, angry light that hissed in the quiet hallway. Marcus backed away, his heels hitting the edge of a floor-to-ceiling glass ledge that overlooked the city. The height was dizzying. The Golden Gate Bridge looked like a fragile, rusted toy, abandoned in a gray bathtub far below. The henchman lunged. Marcus dodged, the taser's prongs missing his chest by an inch. The smell of ozone filled the air. Marcus saw a heavy metal catering cart nearby, left over from some executive lunch. It was loaded with silver platters and heavy porcelain. With a guttural roar, Marcus shoved the cart with all his strength. The cart collided with the henchman's shins. The man let out a sharp cry as he flipped over the metal frame, his taser skittering across the concrete. But the momentum pulled Marcus with it. He lost his footing, his dress shoes sliding on the polished floor. He tumbled down a half flight of concrete steps, his side slamming into the sharp edge of a step. Pain, white and blinding, exploded in his chest. He gasped, unable to draw air. He lay there for a moment, the sound of the henchman groaning above him muffled by the roar of blood in his ears. He touched his side. His ribs felt like they were grinding together. He forced himself to crawl, his fingers clawing at the floor until he reached the heavy, reinforced door of the server room. He swiped David Chen's stolen biometric card. The lock chirped, a friendly, high-pitched sound that felt like a mockery. The door slid open, revealing the server room. It was a place of false comfort, bathed in a deceptively calming blue ambient light. The relentless, high-frequency whine of cooling fans created a steady shh that demanded silence. Marcus stumbled to the central terminal, his vision blurring. He needed to find the $40 million trail and sever the link to his father's identity. But as he logged in, his eyes widened. A progress bar was crawling across the main monitor. System wipe in progress. 42% complete. No, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. No, no, no. Someone was remotely purging the entire Nexalink database. The evidence of the forgery, the logs of Julian's access, the communication records. It was all being dissolved into white noise. He frantically typed, trying to initiate an administrative override, but the system refused to recognize him. It was like a locked door with the wrong key. He tracked the source of the wipe command. It wasn't coming from Julian's office. It was coming from an internal terminal on this very floor. He pulled up the user ID, user D_CHEN_CTO. The betrayal hit harder than the fall in the stairwell. David Chen, the man Marcus had mentored, the man who hummed funeral dirges when he was forced to lie, was the one pulling the trigger. David wasn't a victim. He was the cleaner. The logic doesn't scale, does it, Marcus? Marcus spun around, his hand clutching his injured ribs. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway, framed by the blue light of the servers. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo jacket anymore, and his silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. In his hand, he held a thick, physical folder, the kind of analog evidence Marcus usually trusted. You always said the air was compromised? Julian said, his voice melodic and lingering. You said if it's in the machine, it's a ghost. So I thought I'd bring you something you can actually touch. Something the FBI can touch. Julian tossed the folder onto the server console. It slid across the smooth surface, stopping inches from Marcus's hand. Marcus flipped it open. Inside were physical bank statements, notarized documents, and property deeds, all bearing Marcus's signature and his father's social security number. It was a paper trail that no digital wipe could erase. The feds are in the lobby, Julian continued, stepping closer. Agent Miller is very thorough. She's looking for a thief, Marcus, and I've given her a map that leads straight to your heart. You killed my father's name, Marcus rasped, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and exhaustion. He had nothing to do with this. He was a failure, Julian countered, his smile perfect and cold. I'm just giving him a purpose. He's the foundation of your new life, the one you'll spend in a cell. Now, be a good partner and give me that key card. We wouldn't want you to add assaulting a guard to your list of sins, though I think it's already too late for that. Julian lunged for the folder. Marcus grabbed his wrist, and the two men collided with the force of a decade of resentment. They crashed into a server rack, the high-frequency whine of the fans rising to a shriek. Julian swung a fist, catching Marcus in the jaw. Marcus's head slammed against a cooling unit, shattering a glass partition. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds, sparkling in the blue light. Marcus felt the sharp bite of glass in his palm, but he didn't let go. He pinned Julian against a high-voltage rack, the smell of ozone and burning dust filling his nostrils. As they struggled, Marcus's eyes caught a glimpse of a terminal screen behind Julian's head. It was the old system kernel, the foundational code of Nexalink. 10 years ago, when they were just two kids in a garage, Marcus had hidden a black box protocol. It was a failsafe he'd never told Julian about, a piece of code that lived in the very marrow of the operating system. If the company was ever compromised, the black box would lock the data in a read-only state, bypassing all administrative wipes. With a desperate surge of strength, Marcus reached past Julian's ear and hammered a sequence of keys. Command: Vance _Omega_recovery. The server room lights flickered. The shriek of the fans deepened into a roar. On the monitor, the system wipe bar froze at 89%. The screen turned a deep blood red. Fail-safe active. Data integrity secured. "What did you do?" Julian hissed, trying to shove Marcus away. "I stopped the ghosts," Marcus whispered. The heavy steel door of the server room hissed open. Agent Sarah Miller stood there, her weapon drawn and leveled. Behind her, two other agents fanned out, their boots heavy on the raised floor. "FBI, freeze, hands in the air." Miller's voice was a sharp command that cut through the roar of the servers. Marcus slowly let go of Julian and stepped back, his hands raised, palms bleeding from the glass. He looked at Miller, relief washing over him. "Agent Miller, thank you. The data, it's all here. The wipe was intercepted. You can see the logs now. You can see what he did." He moved toward the console, intending to show her the recovered files, the proof of Julian's betrayal. He believed in the protocol. He believed in the truth. Subverted. Marcus felt a sense of victory. He had outsmarted Julian at the very last second. He had the data, and he had the law in the room. He turned to Miller with a weary smile, his shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. "Look at the terminal, Agent. The communication logs between Thorne and Chen are being decrypted right now. It shows the entire frame-up." Agent Miller didn't look at the terminal. She didn't even glance at Julian, who was smoothing his hair back with a trembling hand. She kept her firearm aimed directly at Marcus Vance's chest. "Step away from the server, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice devoid of the usual apologies. Slowly. "What? No, you don't understand," Marcus stammered, his mind racing to find the flaw in the logic. "The evidence is right here. Julian is the one who—" "I know exactly what's here," Miller interrupted. "I received a tip 4 hours ago. An anonymous whistleblower provided us with the location of the weapon you used to incapacitate Mr. Thorne's security detail. We found it in your executive desk, Marcus, along with a set of forged passports and $50,000 in cash." Julian stepped forward, his face a mask of tragic disappointment. "I tried to stop him, Agent Miller. When I confronted him about the missing funds, he went ballistic. He's been using his father's old offshore accounts for years. I didn't want to believe it. He was my friend." "You called the tip?" Marcus whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. "I had an obligation to the shareholders," Julian said, his voice filled with that theatrical, visionary gravity. "And to the law?" Marcus looked at Miller, pleading. "He's lying. He planted that weapon. He's using my father's identity to hide his own theft." "The paper trail says otherwise," Miller said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "And the fact that you're currently standing over a destroyed server room with a stolen biometric keycard doesn't help your case. You're under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and aggravated assault." The trap was perfect. Julian hadn't just framed him for the fraud. He had anticipated Marcus's smart play. He knew Marcus would fight back, knew he would use the servers, and he had used that very competence to paint Marcus as a desperate criminal trying to burn the evidence down. By saving the data, Marcus had only secured the very forgeries Julian had planted. He was trapped in a cage he had helped build. "Turn around," Miller commanded. "Hands behind your back." The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists. The click of the ratchets sounded like a final judgment. Julian picked up a bottle of water from a nearby table and raised it in a mocking toast. "It's a shame, Marcus," Julian murmured as the agents began to lead him away. "You were always so focused on the code that you forgot to look at the canvas. Legacy is the only currency that matters, and yours just hit zero." Marcus felt the weight of the defeat. He was broke, his reputation was shattered, and he was being hauled away in front of the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. He looked at the server monitors one last time. The red fail-safe screen was still glowing. And then he remembered one more thing. The black box wasn't just a recovery tool. It was a whistleblower. In the original kernel, Marcus had written a zero-trust protocol. It was designed to trigger if the system detected a high-level administrative conflict during a data breach. It didn't just save the data. It broadcasted it. He leaned his head back against the server rack as Miller pushed him toward the door. His fingers, though bound, were inches from the physical emergency broadcast button on the rack's side, a manual override for the building's fire and data safety systems. He slammed his elbow into the button. The server room didn't just hum, it exploded into a symphony of sound. Every monitor in the room, every tablet in the building, and every news ticker in the financial district suddenly flashed with a new stream of data. It wasn't the forgeries. It was the raw, unedited communication logs from Julian's private, off-grid server, the one he thought was untraceable. Because Julian had used the Nexalink backbone to send his private orders to David Chen, the black box had captured every word. Thorne. Make sure the father's SSN is the primary. Vance won't notice until it's too late. Chen. Wipe is ready. 40 million moved to the buyout account. Vance is the ghost. Agent Miller stopped. Her tablet, holstered at her hip, began chirping frantically. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the scrolling text. The color drained from her face. She looked at the logs, then at Julian, then back at the logs. The evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just digital. It was a real-time confession, broadcasting to the SEC, the FBI, and the New York Times simultaneously. "Wait," Miller whispered. She looked at Julian, who had dropped his water bottle. The plastic hit the floor with a dull thud, water spilling across the blue-lit floor. "Agent Miller?" Julian's voice lost its melodic quality. It was thin, high, and terrified. That's a hack. Marcus is manipulating the feed. It's a trick." Miller didn't answer. She reached out and grabbed Julian's arm, her grip like iron. She unlocked Marcus's handcuffs with a sharp click and turned to her fellow agents. "Change of plans," she said, her voice cold. "Arrest Mr. Thorne and find David Chen. Now." The scene erupted into chaos. Julian was shoved against the very server rack where he had mocked Marcus moments before. The visionary was screaming about his legacy, his face contorted with a rage that finally revealed the sociopath beneath the charm. Marcus stood alone in the wreckage. The air smelled of scorched dust and ozone, but for the first time in years, he could breathe. He looked at his hands. They were dirty, bloody, and shaking. He had lost his company. He had lost his fortune. His father's name was still dragged through the mud of a corporate scandal. But as he watched the agents lead Julian away, Marcus felt a strange, hollow peace. He had spent his life trying to control every variable, trying to build walls that no one could climb. In the end, it was the truth, messy, analog, and uncontrollable, that had saved him. He walked out onto the balcony of the 59th floor. The wind chill was brutal, numbing his fingers until they felt like wood. But he didn't care. He gripped the railing, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge. The fog lights were pulsing like a slow, dying heartbeat against the dark water, a rhythmic flashing that seemed to sync with his own breathing. Below him, the Nexalink stock price was zeroing out on the giant digital ticker of the neighboring building. A billion-dollar empire was dissolving into the San Francisco night. Marcus Vance took a deep, steady breath of the evening air. It was cold, sharp, and tasted of salt. He was penniless. He was a pariah. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting the city in a bruised purple light, he realized he was finally a free man. The ghosts in the machine were gone. He straightened his tie one last time, not for a meeting, not for a gala, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Then, he turned away from the edge and walked toward the stairs, leaving the tower and its shadows behind.